Hi, mystery writers. Today I wanted to talk about story arcs, and one of our members, Zane Pay, said, "I'm clueless when it comes to arcs." so, um, yeah, it arcs are can be very confusing, and that's because there's a lot of information out there that is confusing about story arcs. So I hope I can demystify some of that today. First, I wanted to tell you a little story from my screenwriting days, and I worked with a co-writer on several romantic comedies, and I am not a comedy. It's not part of my makeup in story writing. And so he was very talented at getting jokes and funny situations and creating those things. But what happened was the story was like this. There would be a joke, and then another joke, and then another joke. But there was no rising tension. And so part of my role when we wrote these stories together, they were lots of fun to write. Part of my role was to create a structure. And I think if you think of the story arc as the basic skeleton of your story, it'll help, rather than trying to jam your story into story arc points. I'm going to go over them in a minute, but I know that's what happened to me. There's a fabulous book about screenwriting called Save the Cat, and every time I tried to use it with a story that I was writing for a script, I was like, instead of telling this story, I kept trying to figure out where this part of my story was fitting into those beats. So, if you get nothing else from this, it's that don't do that. Be sure to write your story first. Um, okay, so let's dig in here. What is a story arc? It's basically a movement that takes the reader through your story from the opening scene to the closing. All right, it's movement. You want to keep things going. It creates a structure for your story and the timing of events, and the timing is important. And that is one of the basic elements I think that is helpful to use when you think about story arcs. Is when do these events occur in your story? So, and the story arc is aligned with your plot. The arc takes the reader from one state at the beginning to a changed state at the end, and lots of things happen in the middle. It takes them from their everyday world at the beginning through conflicts and obstructions to a crisis that results in a climax, followed by tying up all the loose ends. So in the mysteries that we are writing, that climax is revealing the villain and the confrontation with the villain. I think if you're thinking about using story arcs, you just want to stay with that old premise, keep it simple. The story arc works to keep your reader engaged by leading them through conflict after conflict until a final resolution. But as you go, you want to raise the stakes of those conflicts so it gets more serious for your sleuth protagonist as the story progresses. And the obstacles become more difficult, and your sleuth makes mistakes, and that increases the difficulty to those challenges. So every genre, not just mysteries, needs a story arc. Without an arc, with ups and downs, challenges and obstacles that prevent progress, a story remains flat or at best is episodic with no increasing tension. So I think if you think of a story arc as a tool to help you build tension in your story, um, however it works for you, that is the element that you want. I'm trying to think of how to say this best. So I think the easiest way to approach it is to not think about the bits and pieces and is my story fitting this label right now? Beginning writers can get lost in the number of story arcs and story arc structure models that are out there in the universe. And just to make it more complicated, many course instructors have taken the basic model of the story arc, renamed the parts, and sell these structure guidelines as their own, but they're not their own. Stories are universal, all right? So the best way to stay clear about creating rising tension, building to an exciting conclusion, is to create rising and falling action in your story. So something happens, and especially when your protagonist is defeated or takes a wrong turn, the action falls as they try to rethink what they need to do. Most story arc structures are based on Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. He delineated 17 different story stages, but claimed that not all stages are needed in every story. Phew, oh, what a relief. You don't have to take all 17 and see if your story has them all. So I'm just going to quickly run through them because you probably hear these words a lot. The call to adventure, the refusal to the call, the supernatural, crossing over the threshold, on the belly of the whale. Whoops, I'm losing my place here. The start of the trials. And hold on a second. I have to scooch this over so I can read these to you so I don't screw this up. Okay, the road of trials, the meeting with the goddess, woman as temptress, atonement with the father, apotheosis, the ultimate boon. If these aren't making sense to you, it's very understandable. So don't worry about that, all right? These are arbitrary names. I just want to make that clear. They're very arbitrary. And then we have the refusal of the return, the magic flight, the rescue from without, the crossing of the return threshold, the master of two worlds, and finally the freedom to live. If you're wondering how all that fits into your mystery, you're not alone. So let's talk a little bit about how to use the story arc. Your goal with using an arc is to deepen the story's intensity. And as a writer, you want to intensify to keep your reader from putting down your story. It's that simple, right? The main idea of a story arc is to create conflicts and setbacks that rise in intensity over the course of the story. So the problems for your sleuth get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, all right? So let's look at a few stages of using the story arc. As you develop your story, you plan scenes around the prime points of the story, the initial world, the turning point, which is called the crossing the threshold, the big crisis, and the climax. And as you outline the story, The story arc helps you build in the major highs and lows. And I think that's the easiest way to think about it. Whatever you call them, whatever you labels you want to put on them, there are certain basic things that need to happen in a story, especially in a mystery, to keep your readers turning those pages and developing interest, all right, and keeping their interest. So, first of all, I'm going to say it again, focus on writing your story rather than attempting to hit 17 stages of a story arc, all right? You can check for holes in the arc after you've written your story in your editing stage. And here's my suggestion, is that you choose 6 to 8 major points and use those to develop your storyline. And I'm going to tell you why in a minute. First, you want to start at the beginning and with the stasis, the protagonist in their everyday world. That does not mean eating breakfast. That means how your protagonist interacts with the world around them. And then there's a trigger, something unusual happens for us as mystery writers. That's usually the discovery of a crime, and usually a murder. And now there's the quest. Your sleuth takes on solving the problem. Depending on the type of mystery you're writing, they may actually be assigned that case if they're in some kind of law enforcement, but there's something that gives them a commitment to solving that problem. So then there's some kind of surprise. Things aren't quite as simple as they first appeared when your sleuth took a first look. And then there's a critical choice, and that is often at the midpoint, and we've talked about the midpoint before. It's making a choice about what to do next, and that's usually because whatever happened before didn't work very well. All right. And then we get that climax confrontation with the antagonist, or the antagonist reveals their power and gets your sleuth into one last big problem. And it may even feel like a reversal, that the antagonist villain has the upper hand, but that can't possibly happen because our hero is the hero, right? So then there's the resolution, and the protagonist overcomes the antagonist. They figure it out in a mystery, and that you are the one. All right. So if you have those basic 7 or 8 points in your head as you write, and even if you write them down, which I think is very helpful, when you actually write, after you've kind of planned these major points in your story, so you know you're going to have some rising tension, you probably have an end in mind. You may know who the villain is. Not everyone who writes mysteries does know at the start of their story, but you have an end in mind, and that end is the revelation of the villain. As you're writing, instead of, I've said this before too, instead of looking to the end for that big reveal, think about the next point in your major point in your story. For example, if your protagonist has just taken on solving that problem, looking for the villain, looking for the killer, instead of thinking about the end, think about how you're going to get them to the next point, which is the surprise. It's not as easy as it first appeared. So what seeds are you going to plant in this section of your story that take your sleuth to that surprise of it's not being as easy as they thought? And if your sleuth has confidence, this can be a real blow to their ego because they thought they could figure it out and now they can't. But you've gone from the quest to the surprise, all right? And then the same thing again, when you get to the surprise, when the sleuth figures out, whoops, it's not quite as easy as they thought it was going to be at the beginning, and obstacles have presented themselves. Now you're going to take your sleuth to the next point and say it's the critical choice. They have to make a choice about what to do next. They have to rethink everything. So it's just my suggestion that if you go from point to point, rather than thinking about writing to the whole end of the story, that's going to help you with filling in the details of the scenes. So you want to write each scene so it heads toward the next high or low in the story. And this will keep you from rushing to the end, all right? So going from point to point allows you to focus on each stage of the story journey. It kind of slows you down in your mind about where you are in your story and what you're doing and what your focus is right now. Your focus is this scene right now, okay? And then when you get to your edits, the story arc is a good way to check it to see if you actually do have any plot holes, if there are some important features that are missing in your story, so that the whole entire story flows and you can fill in those missing elements as you go through your revision editing process. This is especially helpful for writers who don't plan that much, who are, known as pantsers, writing by the seat of their pants. So you can check that story arc once you've completed your story. But once again, I want to stress that writing your story is the first and most important thing that you should be doing. So writing your story and writing so it progresses and so that the problems get bigger as you go along, you're going to be much more successful and you're going to feel better about your story if you think of it that way, rather than trying to fit your story into whatever plot point you use, whether it's Save the Cat beats or the 17 original heroes journey points. Writing your story is the most important part of what you need to do, and the story arc is basically how the story builds to that conclusion. You want to create and time events in your storyline to keep the reader's interest. That's the basic thing you want to do. So reversals and plot twists send the story in a new direction or complicate the story. And then, just as a side note, many writers also use character arcs, which kind of follow the same pattern for the main characters in their stories. So, of course, our first main character is our protagonist, and their arc is the story arc, right? But many writers create separate arcs for major characters, and that's totally your personal choice. Creating arcs for other characters enriches your story and provides fresh ways to grab your reader's attention. Remember, we've got a lot of words to write and a lot of pages to fill. So that's one way that you can do it. So you can weave the points of the character arcs into the main story and the subplots to create reader engagement. So that's all I want to say about character arcs today. So let's go back to the story arc. You can see from the varied suggestions that the elements of the story arc are up to you. They're up to you. You can name them whatever you want, all right? As long as you understand that you're building tension, you're raising the stakes as the story progresses. The goal of the story arc isn't to jam pieces of your story to fit into a formula. Because that's going to feel like a formula and not very interesting, and the readers will know and they won't be happy. But you want to create a story that leads your reader from an emotional reading journey. You want to keep them interested. You want to have them ask themselves, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? That's what you want to evoke in your readers. So your mystery genre dictates which parts of the arc you will emphasize, and the genre suggests the types of obstacles and conflicts and triumphs and setbacks that you create in your story, because the major goal of the story is to solve that crime. All right, everything else is headed in that one direction, to solve the crime, to find the villain. So the principal point of using a story arc is to make your story interesting. How simple is that? You want to keep readers engaged. You want it to grab your reader emotionally and excite them to keep reading. So I hope this helps. I especially hope for people like Zane, who are like, whoa, I'm clueless, that you just create some major story points and write from point to point and keep building the stakes until you get to that final reveal when your protagonist, Sleuth, reveals the villain. And I hope that helps. And so, of course, as always, if you have any questions about story arcs or how they work with mysteries, please leave them in the comments. I'm happy to answer your questions, and thanks for being a member of the Mystery Writer Studio. I'll see you next week.